Reactive training systems.
And the first presentation I want to talk about is something I'm really excited to talk about. How does personality affect the way that you should train? Now, we started this investigation. This has been a long time in the making, and we started with this question. And it's the title of the presentation: how does personality affect the way that you should train? Now, anecdotally, as coaches, we've all seen this before. We've seen different athletes. We've seen certain people just respond differently. And it seems like there's a connection between their personality and just kind of how they are as people and the kind of training that they respond to. So we wanted to look at that a little bit closer, and see, like, is there a connection that we can measure? Is there a connection that maybe gets a little bit predictive? So that's where this came from, So another component of this is, when I've talked about RPE training since forever, one thing that comes up is, like, what type of personality responds best to RPE type training? And it's something that I've always described as controlled aggressive. You want to be the kind of lifter who, if we leave the decision up to you, you put another 2.5 pounds on the bar. You put a little bit more weight on the bar. You have that desire, like, we'll round up, But you also have to have enough control and restraint to say, that's not a good decision. I'm going to do what I'm supposed to and have some control. So that's always how I've described it. And I wanted to see, is there a more specific description that we could get to? Is there a way that you could know in advance, am I one of these people? So some lofty goals as we set out here, but it's not just about psychology either. As I've talked about this with different people, they kind of have the impression that it's mostly about psychology, and that lifters are pretty much the same physiologically between all of us, and there's psychological differences, but that always gets trivialized. Okay. Well, there's a specific personality test called the Temperament and Character Inventory, and it's been shown that different personality types on the TCI have been linked to different, like, baseline levels of neurotransmitters in the brain. So novelty seekers are a bit lower in dopamine than the average. Harm avoidance people are higher in serotonin, and reward dependence people are low in noradrenaline. Now, you can't go straight from that to a training intervention. I don't think you can go straight from, hey, I'm low in dopamine, therefore I should train this way, because the human body's complex. There's a ton of different things that are all going to interact together, and being low in dopamine, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should change your training intervention just based on that alone. So we wanted to see, are there any sort of relationships that actually do manifest into training differences? And the reason I bring this up, we actually didn't use the TCI for this for some good reasons I'll get into, but it shows that there's a link between psychology and physiology. So we're going to be talking about people's personality differences and different personality types and personality characteristics. Keep in mind that that's not just a psychological difference. That there could be some physiological differences that go along with that. And which one is responsible for the other, I don't know, and it's not necessarily the critical point of this type of question. So we sent out a survey to as wide of an audience as we could get. Now, the survey itself had some basic biometric and performance questions. Then we asked them to take a Big Five inventory. We asked them to go to a third-party site, take a Big Five inventory, and report back to us their results. Now, we chose the Big Five for some specific reasons, and I've got a lot of questions on which personality test we used and why we chose it. So we chose Big Five, and the reason we chose it is because, as far as I can tell, it's got the most scientific validity of any of the personality tests. The reason that's important is if you take a personality test and then you wait a few hours and take a personality test again, you should get roughly the same results. And some tests, like say Myers-Briggs, which I would say is probably the most popular personality test, don't have much in terms of validity. You know, if you are emotionally upset by one thing or another, that can drastically affect your results. With Big Five, it affects the results less. And we can talk specifically about what that looks like if you like. But the other thing is that it needed to be freely available. We're trying to cast this net as wide as we can, and free availability is important. Also, it needed to be online. Some tests, like the TCI that I mentioned, are not freely available, and also they need to be administered by a professional. Both of those are going to be kind of no-go situations for this type of survey. So that's what led us to Big Five. And we also asked for training preference data. So specifically, what type of training do you respond best to? Not what type of training do you like the most, what type of training are you doing right now, not those things, but what type of training do you respond best to? And we got about 640 respondents, which was really cool. But I want to talk a little bit about what the Big Five is and the parameters that it measures and stuff like that. So Big Five obviously measures personality across 5 personality dimensions. It spells the acronym OCEAN. Now that's something that we're going to come back to a lot in this presentation. But the first parameter is openness to experience. Now, openness to experience these are people who seek out novel experiences. They're more creative, they're more intellectual. They seek out art, music, new food, new cultures, stuff like that. People who are low in openness, they tend to prefer routine. They tend to be uncomfortable with new experiences. They prefer a little bit more familiarity. So a lot of people have confusion about openness. It's not whether or not you like those things, because lots of people like new experiences when they're pleasant, but it's not about whether you like it. It's about whether you seek them out. You know, if I use myself as an example, I like those things, but I know that if you leave it up to me, I tend to follow my little routine and I don't go outside of my bubble very much. My wife, on the other hand, is much higher in openness, and she tends to seek those things out and drags me along with her. Now, I like those things once I'm doing them, but left up to me, I don't seek them out very much. So that's more about what openness is all about. The second one is conscientiousness. High conscientiousness people are more organized, they're responsible, they're orderly, dutiful, they tend to respect authority and follow rules. Low orderliness people are perceived as a bit more careless, but they're more spontaneous, they're more unstructured, they're also perceived as being more relaxed. Extroversion is one that a lot of people are pretty familiar with. Now, these traits may be slightly different than what the common usage of the word would imply. So for extroversion, high extroversion people are more talkative, they're more sociable, adventurous, and they tend to take a bit more risk. Now, high extroversion is also associated with more positive emotions. Now, that's an important thing that we'll come back to again as well, but feelings of more positive emotions. Low extroversion people tend to prefer more time alone. When they do get together with people, they prefer more low energy gatherings, and they're more even-keeled emotionally. The fourth one is agreeableness. Now, high agreeableness people, they tend to want close social relationships. They're more empathetic and more caring. Low agreeableness people have less of a relationship focus. They're more blunt and less willing to hide their feelings for the sake of those relationships. So one way to think about it, high agreeableness people are more cooperative, they're more socially oriented. Low agreeableness people are more competitive. And then the final one is neuroticism. Neuroticism, people high in neuroticism tend to experience frequent shifts in mood, so there's a high mood volatility, a high volatility to their emotions. And they also more frequently experience negative emotions, things like fear, anxiety, stress. Low neuroticism people are less emotional overall, and they tend to stay closer to their baseline. So that's just kind of a quick primer on what the Big Five's all about. So we sent this personality test out and got all this data back. And now it's time to analyze it. Now we started with a core assumption. Like I said, we got about 640 respondents, and we needed to pare that down. So the core assumption that we made here is that if we looked at people who've been training for a long time and have reached a high level, that those people would know a bit about what they respond best to. They would know a bit more than the person who's only been training for 6 months or something, right? So if we sort all this data and only look at those people who meet that criteria, that maybe we find out a bit more about what type of training works best, okay? So we had some inclusion criteria. The first one is that you must fill out your birthday correctly. So we ask people for their birthday, and so if you filled it out and I calculate that you're negative 5 years old, we threw out your data from the start. My apologies, but I feel like if you, it's said on there too, make sure that you get the birth year correct. And if you didn't do that, then I feel like it's of limited reliability. We also said that you must be 18 years old or older, that you need to have a minimum training age of 4 years, and a minimum Wilks of 375, which would be, for most weight classes, a class 1 in the old Russian classification chart, if you're familiar with such things. So that left us with a sample population. We had 166 people that met that criteria. The average age was 30 years. The average training age was 8.3 years, which is pretty awesome. The average Wilks score was 424, which is also very good. Now, I have the average Big 5 scores listed on the screen as well. A bit about the Big 5 scores. You're scored on a scale from 1 to 100, and they're percentile scores. So if you are average among people, you're going to be at the 50th percentile, okay? So when we look at openness, we're looking at experienced and high-level powerlifters. The average openness score was a 40, so a bit below average. Now, you're thinking, keep in mind too, that if you're averaging this across 166 people, there's a regression to the mean, okay? There's a regression to 50th percentile. So a small deviation on this mean means more than, if you had scored a 40 yourself, okay? So a 40 across this average is actually fairly significant. So they tend to be a bit low in openness. They tend to be quite high in conscientiousness. They tend to be around average in extroversion and agreeableness, and low in neuroticism. So that kind of makes sense, right? Like if you're gonna lift weights for 8 years consistently and achieve a high level at this, maybe you're a bit low in openness. Maybe you prefer routine. Maybe you're high in conscientiousness and you like things to be orderly, and you're dutiful and you are cautious and you carry things out. Your agreeableness and extroversion maybe don't play into that so much, and maybe you are low in neuroticism. You tend not to be really volatile in your emotions. That kind of makes sense, right? If you're going to stick with this for that long, then that's probably the personality that this sport selects for. So now I want to talk more specifically about the results that we got from this. So we're going to start with an easy example. We ask people how much they like to psych up. So what we're looking at here, we've got 3 different charts. We asked them about how much they like to psych up. They had 3 possible answers. In the top left, they said, all my psych up is internal all the time. In the top right, they said, I have kind of this mix between external psych up and internal. I only show emotion for my top sets. And then the bottom center chart looks like I got the top label incorrect here, but it's correct on the legend. Sorry about that. But these are people who like to show a lot of emotion, who psych up a lot all the time, okay? And these numbers just next to each chart, they show the number of people that fit into all those categories. So most people in this intervention are kind of in that middle category, which is what you'd expect. And the fewest number were those like high psych up types of people. Now, we're looking at these charts. This red line is your population average. So if we averaged everybody over all 166 high-level lifters, that's what we got. Now, the blue line is this specific group of responders, okay? So the red line is our average, and then the blue line is our deviations from that. So what we can see if we look at the people who like a lot of psyching up, we see that they tend to be higher in extroversion and higher in neuroticism, okay? So it's ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And it's kind of listed across the bottom here in all of these slides, so you can reference that. So you like psyching up, tend to be higher in extroversion, higher in neuroticism. Well, that kind of makes sense, right? High extroversion people tend to feed off of that emotion in the environment. They gain energy off of that, so that makes sense. Now, the high neuroticism piece, I think the explanation for that, now keep in mind that those people tend to feel the feelings a little bit more. You know, they tend to feel a little bit more fear, anxiety, and if you're going to approach a set, and for them it's more any set, and they're feeling that, then maybe you use aggression to mask that feeling. Okay, that's kind of my quick story explanation for why we may see that observation. So I throw a lot of these in there. Some we have great stories as far as explaining it away, others not so much. So one example of that is frequency. Okay, so next up we're talking about training frequency. We had a few different response categories. People who train the competition lifts, now this is competition lifts only, people who train the comp lifts once or twice a week, 2 or 3 times a week, or 3 or 4 times a week. Now, for once or twice a week and 2 or 3 times a week, they stay fairly close to the average. Now, we see some deviations when we get people that train the comp lifts a lot. We see that they tend to be higher in openness, they tend to be lower in conscientiousness, and higher in agreeableness. Now, why might that be? I have no idea. I can't think of a reason why that would be, but it's something that we observe. And that's why I think stuff like this is great and important, because just because we can't explain it right now doesn't mean it's not a thing. And so now we know about it and we can account for it, and maybe we can start to answer the why question as time goes on. The next thing is intensity. So if we divided intensity up into 3 categories, now this is the most effective intensity range across an array of different exercises, okay? So we see that as intensity goes up, extroversion also goes up. So people that tend to train with low intensity are a bit low in extroversion, and then as that intensity goes up, extroversion also goes up. And then also at the highest intensity levels, we see a spike in agreeableness. And I'm not real sure what that's about, but the extroversion thing is interesting. I think that comes from, now remember, if we think about extroverted people, they like that external stimulus. They like, they derive energy from that external stimulus. So that also makes sense, right? But there were also no effect in a couple areas that I expected to see. I thought that as intensity went up, we'd see an increase in openness, kind of wanting a novel experience. Didn't see that. I also thought conscientiousness would play into this somehow. Didn't see that. And also I thought surely neuroticism would play into this, but didn't see that either. It was mostly about extroversion. And I thought that was interesting. This one is probably maybe one of the most interesting parameters that we checked. We're talking about progression. Now, what kind of progression do you like in your training? Now, think about it in terms of two poles, okay? We have fixed progressions, which tend to be more percentage-based programs. It's all laid out there for you. And we have open progressions, things like RPEs, reps in reserve, AMRAP sets, stuff like that, okay? So people that preferred fixed progressions tend to be low in openness and high in conscientiousness. Now, that makes sense as well, right? So if you're low in openness and you prefer routine and you don't seek out new experiences, and you're also high in conscientiousness, probably orderliness, the orderliness branch of conscientiousness, meaning that you like things to fit in their little box and you don't want to go outside of that. Percentage-based training fits with that quite well. Now, if you're a different kind of person, maybe you're a bit higher in openness and a bit lower in conscientiousness, maybe you're more open to trying things like RPE-based training. So one quick caveat to this, you'll notice that we only had 15 respondents that said that they do percentage-based training only. And I think that's a limitation I don't think that's reflective of powerlifting at large. Like, I think that's a limitation based on my sphere of influence. So I put the survey out. I tend to have an audience more with people who like RPE-based training and things like that. So, but I do think that that's an interesting result and makes sense as well. Another thing, excuse me, another thing that was interesting, let's look at the agreeableness score. You see lower agreeableness in percentage-based training and also in open progression training. Higher agreeableness in the mixed modal styles. I don't know what that's about, you know, but that's interesting. Maybe low agreeableness people are like, you know, this is the way and I want to do it that way. And higher agreeableness people are more willing to be flexible. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting observation, I think. Then there is average RPE. What types of average RPE do you tend to like? This one was counterintuitive to me. As RPE went up, neuroticism also went up. And that was the opposite of what I expected. I thought that as RPE went up, you would see neuroticism go down because those people, again, tend to feel those negative emotions a bit more. And I thought exposure to high RPEs would exacerbate that and make it worse. Now, I spoke to Greg Nuckols about this, and he said that to him it made sense, that he thought it's easier to judge high RPEs. And since you can be more certain of high RPEs, that maybe high neuroticism people would have a preference for that. I don't know. That doesn't really resonate with me, but you know, this is all storytelling at this point. But that's a phenomenon that we observed. So I thought that was interesting, and to me, counterintuitive. Then we wanted to look at volume. Now, we looked at volume a couple different ways. The first way that we looked at it was total number of sets. So we asked people how many working sets do they do. And we aggregated all that stuff together, and we looked at it this way. And it's a mess, you know? And there's really no clear, that I can see, there's no clear trends that emerge from that. And so I started thinking about, like, why might that be? And I think that it's possible that people count working sets differently. I mean, to some people, a working set is your top set and everything else is a warm-up. But then other people count everything. And so maybe the resolution of the data isn't very good for a question like this. So at this point, I was thinking maybe this is your ideal dependent variable, right? So if we have a good reason to pick intensity or RPE based on personality, then you can just adjust that volume knob to fit whatever you need it to fit. And maybe that's true, but then we looked at it a little different way and it's not so clear. We looked at total training time. So how much time in a week do you spend in the gym? And I think that's a proxy volume measure. You know, if you spend more time in the gym, chances are you're doing a bit more work. You know, it's not high resolution, but it's something, right? Now, we did notice some trends here. People that tended to spend the least amount of time in the gym tended to be low in extroversion and high in neuroticism. And then that neuroticism level dropped as training time increased. So as training times increased, low training times are associated with low extroversion. Now, maybe that's because low extroversion people tend to be a little bit more easily overstimulated, so a long training time doesn't really make sense for those types of people. And then the neuroticism also seems to make sense, again, with the sensitivity to negative emotion and things like that. So higher training volumes being associated with more extroversion and less neuroticism. So that interesting, right? Then we looked at training session time, and we noticed as training session time increased, there was a trend of increasing agreeableness. Now, why might that be? You know, I don't, again, this is storytelling at this point, but I'm thinking that Maybe there's a social component to going to the gym for a lot of people. And if you tend to be higher in agreeableness, you like that and you want to be around your friends and whatnot, and it takes you a bit longer to train maybe, but maybe that's associated with higher session time. And also at the highest session times, it's associated with higher extroversion. So long training sessions are difficult a lot of times and somewhat monotonous and boring at times as well. I mean, let's be honest. So maybe that's better suited for people who are higher in extroversion than people who are low in extroversion. The agreeableness thing I think is interesting though. So maybe it's a social aspect of training, or maybe it's people who are low in agreeableness tend to be more competitively focused. Maybe it's that if you're competitively focused, it's difficult to sustain that amount of energy for a long training session, and it tends to result in shorter training sessions. I don't know. Okay. Now let's talk training sessions per week. How many training sessions do you do in a given week? We have 3 or fewer training sessions, 4 training sessions, 5 training sessions, and 6 training sessions. Now, this was really interesting. As the number of training sessions increased, there was a reliable increase in the amount of extroversion. Again, like that makes sense. We're seeing this trend of extroversion, neuroticism being our major players here. Like we're seeing that trend show up. And also there's a clear trend for a reduction in neuroticism. So that too was interesting. And at this point, I'm sure you're kind of getting the picture, right? Extroversion, neuroticism are playing into that sensitivity to training stimulus. High extroversion, low neuroticism tends to like the stimulus. Low extroversion, high neuroticism tends to perceive things like that as fatiguing, draining, anxiety producing, stuff like that. And then the last metric that we looked at was variation. How much variation do you like to have in your training? So the way that we measured this was we asked people how many different exercises do you do in a given training week. And the assumption is the fewer total number of exercises you do, the more you're concentrated on probably the competition lifts, but you're more concentrated on a smaller number of disciplines. And then the more exercises you do, obviously the more exercises you do. So the trend that we notice here is that as training variation increases, conscientiousness increases. And I don't have a great explanation for that. So maybe that's a second or third order effect from something else, but that's how it bears out. You know, there's a slight increase in conscientiousness. Oh, by the way, I put big X's on these two because these are the highest variation groups. And although they're very interesting tables, they just have really small group numbers. You know, in particular, the 28 to 35 exercises group, I mean, that's a lot of exercises in a given week. We only have 4 people fall into that category, okay? So if we had more people, that graph could look a lot different. So I don't want to consider those too much, but I thought they were interesting, so I put them up here. The other thing that we see is a decrease in neuroticism. Now, I do have a story for that one. My thought is that if you're higher in neuroticism and you tend to feel anxiety more, right, that maybe you want to stick closer to the competition lips because that gives you a bit more confidence. There's less uncertainty as far as, is this exercise going to work for me? And it just helps you be more certain of your training. But we see that people with lower neuroticism tend to be more willing to experiment in their training. The conscientiousness thing is a bit puzzling to me, though. I don't really get that one. So those are the different parameters that we looked at. Now I want to talk real quick about the limitations of an investigation like this. Okay? First, there's the core assumption itself. Now I talked about this earlier. I said that the assumption is we have this group of people, and if we only look at the people who are high level and have been doing this for a long time, that they know something about their training. Now, that seems reasonable, at least it seems reasonable to me. That could be wrong though. So I think it's important to at least acknowledge that. Also, a survey like this is dependent on the accuracy of the recall of the people who are doing it, so that's a bit of a limitation as well. Now, you'd like to think that if you've been doing this for 8 years that you've settled down enough that you can recall what you're doing, but I don't know. I don't know how certain we ought to be of that. Another limitation is that we had people do the Big Five inventory. Now, the Big Five inventory is a specific Big Five test. It's 44 questions long. My thought was that we were asking people to take this survey. As it was, the survey took 20 or 30 minutes to complete. That's with the 44 question Big Five test. There's also a test called the IPIP 300. The IPIP 300 is a 300 question Big Five test, and it's more accurate. It's used in clinical practice and things like that. But that would have greatly increased the amount of time required to complete the survey, and I thought we would get a lot fewer respondents. So again, you have to make decisions on trade-offs, so that's the way we went. So would things have looked differently if we'd used the IPIP 300? Probably a bit. But I mean, the Big Five inventory is a Big Five test, so hopefully not a night and day difference. Then there are also exceptions to these generalities. What I'm talking about here are generalities. So if you are high neuroticism, now remember we said that high neurotic people tended to prefer, for example, high RPE training. If you're high in neuroticism and you hate high RPE training, you're not weird, okay? There are a lot of people that fall into that category. There were tons of exceptions to these general rules, but as we aggregated this data over a big enough population, we started to see these trends come out. So the idea here is that this is generally the pattern that we see. Now, if you're an exception to this, that's totally fine, totally reasonable, likely even that those exceptions are gonna happen. Also, this is not causal, it's merely associative. So it's not that because you're low in neuroticism that you should train this way. We don't know that yet. This is just the very beginning of investigations like this. With that said, I want to leave you with a few take-home points. Again, once we consider the limitations of an investigation like this, what we're left with is a good starting point. Hopefully this provides you with a little bit of a direction to take your own self-experimentation. As you try new things in your training, you can keep this in mind and you're thinking, man, my bench is really stuck and I don't know what to do about it. Well, maybe this can help give you some ideas. Now, if you try it and that doesn't work, then it doesn't work. You're an exception to one of these rules. So don't keep beating that dead horse if you've tried it and you know that this isn't for you. Okay? So what can you do with this? First, you could take a Big Five test. If you wanted to take the Big Five inventory, which as I said is the test that was given in this intervention, you can go to personalityassessor.com/Big5 and take the Big Five inventory. If you'd prefer to take the IPIP 300, you can do that at personalityassessor.com/IPIP300. And again, those tests are free to take. Now, once you have that, you can look at this chart and get an idea of what might be some good ideas for you in terms of training. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole thing and read it to you because I think you're perfectly capable of doing that, and I'm a little bit time limited, and I would rather talk about some specific case examples. But this is kind of generally the findings all summed up in a nice handy little chart. The practical examples I want to talk about, I pulled two athletes, okay? These are two fairly high-level female athletes that I've been working with for a long time. I wanted to pull two people that I feel I know in terms of training, like I know what works for them in terms of training. And I wanted to look at their personality data and see what this Big Five test tells me about what ought to work for them and see how they match up. So athlete number one, you can see tends to be fairly average in terms of openness and conscientiousness, tends to be really high in extroversion, really low in agreeableness, and really high in neuroticism, okay? So what does the Big Five test tell us about that athlete? Well, high extroversion suggests more psyching up, higher intensities, more training sessions. Low agreeableness suggests single method progression. So either RPE or percentages, not both, okay? It also suggests they prefer shorter sessions. And then high neuroticism, again, suggests more psyching up, high RPE, lower volume, fewer sessions, fewer variations, okay? Now, you can see a few things are in agreement, right? A lot of psyching up. It shows up both in the extroversion and the neuroticism score. Now, there are also some contradictions. The extroversion score suggests more sessions. The neuroticism score suggests fewer sessions. So just kind of take it like a vote, okay? If, like for psyching up, they're in agreement. So that's probably a more likely idea to succeed. The sessions are in disagreement, so who knows? We'll have to try them both, you know? Now I can tell you this is fairly accurate for this particular lifter. She doesn't necessarily prefer the single method progression. The higher intensities, higher RPEs, lower volumes, yeah, for the most part, but not all the time. And that's another aspect of this, is that these things, one training program doesn't interest people forever. So there needs to be a bit of variation here. But with an athlete who prefers fewer variations, I can tell you that holds really true. If you take somebody like me and put them on that program, I would be very bored, but it is sufficient for her. Now, athlete number 2 is quite different. Okay, high conscientiousness, high extroversion, high agreeableness, low neuroticism. So prefers percentage-based training, more variation, more psyching up, higher intensities, more sessions, comp lifts more often, mixed progressions, longer sessions, low RPEs, high volumes, more sessions, more variations. So if you kind of imagine a training program in each of those different scenarios, those training programs are going to look a lot different, okay? And I think that's important. That was one of the interesting things that I took away from this, is that it's almost like the things that you like and prefer and respond well to are not so much linked to the inherent superiority of that method, but more about how that method and you and your psychology and physiology and everything else interact together. Okay? So it's not about one thing being inherently superior to another. It's about the thing being what's most in agreement with you, the individual. So that's what I've got. That's what I found out. That's what I learned. Hopefully you guys took away something from this as well. And I've only got a couple minutes, but I do want to take any questions if you guys have any. Yes? Oh, sorry. We have a mic. It's not like linked up to an audio or anything, but it's so the people on the live stream can hear your question.
Last weekend's meet as my babies. Did you consider?
No, you're fine. It's not. It's just for the.
What role if an athlete works with a coach might play on it? For example, if you're high in agreeableness, you might have a longer training session because you're working with a coach, and it's going to take longer to get through the session.
Well, so that's a very interesting thing. There's a lot of dynamics that play into this. One thing that we looked at just as a coaching staff was if you look at only our athletes who we've been working with for 6 months or more, so the assumption being these are the people who like working with you and who've decided to stay, what sort of personality traits do we see happen kind of washing out there? And we definitely see some differences. For example, I tend to be lower in extroversion, but my clients tend to be higher in extroversion. So that's interesting, and that kind of makes sense. Other things tend to not make sense so much, but we definitely see patterns in terms of a coach's clientele. But then, like, take the example I just gave about my clients tend to be higher in extroversion. Is that simply a personality matchup? Or is there a training tendency in play there as well? So that would be like a second order thing. Remember that people who are higher in extroversion tended to want more stimulus, right? They wanted more training volumes and longer sessions and stuff like that. Maybe I just have a tendency to program that way. And so that works well for the people who are higher in extroversion, and those people tend to stay. I don't know. It could be either way. It's probably both, I would say. Any other questions? I probably have time for one more now, but we can always do more during the Q&A later. Okay. Yeah. So the question that we asked was about what training methods and what training styles work best for you. And so the hope is that for those people who've been doing this a long time and have got to a high level, that they have tried sufficient numbers of things and have kind of found those things that work best for them. But again, maybe that's too hopeful of a assumption. So what we want to do with this is that we can use this as a starting point, and from here we can do more specific investigations. You know, we can say, okay, what if we are more prescriptive with this? What if we take all the people and take their extroversion scores and assign them to training programs based on their extroversion, or based on all the big five? Does that work better than assigning them randomly? You know, that would be an interesting thing to try, and it'll probably be something that we work on in the future. So, limitations to assumptions, right? But, okay, so that's all the time that I've got. I don't want to horn in on any of the other presenters and their time. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back at 9 o'clock for the next presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Reactive Training Systems.